Welcome to the Elite Animation Academy's workshop demonstration. My name is Dana Corrigan. I am a teacher at the Tampa campus, and for this demonstration we're going to be going over human body proportions, focusing on the body overall as well as hands and feet a little bit. So one thing you may notice that they talked about a lot was they didn't take a ruler and measure the length of each piece. Instead, they actually used the person's own body parts to measure themselves. That becomes really, really useful if you're trying to draw yourself, try to draw your friend, trying to draw a model, because that's something that you can maybe aim, kind of put your fingers around it, see how large their head is, and then just kind of measure out quickly how tall are they, what are their proportions from their head to their body. Typically, but not always, the shorter the person, usually the less head length, means the larger their head is in proportion to their body. Typically, the taller the person is, adversely, the smaller their head tends to be from their body. So I took a few images and tried out his technique. So there am I, right there, giving a presentation. And then there's my head height. So I happen to be about 7 heads tall, I believe. 3, 4, yeah, 7 heads tall. And then I took another image of me in a group shot, one, to compare myself to the person next to me, and also to see if the camera angle matters. So in here, I am also still 7 heads tall. And then my friend next to me, who's slightly shorter, actually happens to be about 7 1/3 heads tall. So it's not always the same. Kind of like it was mentioned in the video, not everybody's going to have the exact same proportions, even if they're a little shorter or a little taller. Not everybody's going to follow that rule. Everybody's different. And then last, I have 2 gentlemen posing, and their heads tall. And they're about the same height, roughly. And he is about 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 heads tall. And he's about 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 6.5 heads tall, but his mouth's also open, so that might be giving him a little bit extra, making his head seem a little extra larger than it normally is. So, with that in mind, also in general, animated characters will sometimes follow this route. So, for example, Korra from Legend of Korra is about 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 heads tall, 7 and like maybe 1/3 heads tall. I took off her ponytail because that doesn't count. Now Marvel characters tend to like to go a little bit smaller on the head, larger on the body. So Captain America is, I believe, about 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, about 8, 8.5 heads tall. So Marvel characters tend to like to go taller and smaller head with their characters. Now, not all animated characters follow this technique. You know, him, for example, he's maybe a head and 1/3 or head and 1/4. Now, in this demonstration, we're not going to be going over those type of proportions. That'll actually be for a later demonstration. So again, not all cartoon characters, just like all people, follow the same proportions. So what we're going to do first is practice a little bit of drawing. Now, sometimes when you're trying to draw something very accurately, backgrounds, figures, where there's a lot of little things you can measure, sometimes it can feel a little bit constraining to draw them that way, to try to measure it out from the get-go. So usually what we'll do sometimes is we'll just rough out the character's outline as we see fit, but very softly. I'm going to be using a blue marker as my soft pencil. But what you guys will be doing on your paper is drawing very, very softly so that you can make any corrections with an eraser very easily and then draw harder once you're comfortable with the proportions. So what I would do is draw it about freehand. Now the character's just going to be standing like this. We're starting boring. We'll get more interesting once we get more used to drawing the character with proportion. So we're going to draw the character straight ahead, arms down, very just normal, neutral pose, symmetrical. And you can see over here, right? Okay, fantastic. Try standing over here. So we're going to start off with just very simple shapes. Because typically when we draw a character, we like to start with very simple, basic shapes so that we can build on them and then get more detailed. So we'll start with the head. And just be like the eye placement. We'll get more into heads another time. Then we have the neck. So we're going to start off very loose. Pretend this is a very light pencil. And then we're going to go back and do corrections. Now, men and women actually have very different body types a little bit. So this one's a little bit more male. Females have a little bit more of a curvature. So we have hips, and we'd bring in the waistline a little bit. For a male, you would be more straight down. So we do something like a boxy type shape for the upper body. Then we'd add shoulders. And then we'd have the legs. The arms are going to be loose. Your hands, if you stand up and put your hands down by your sides, the tip of your fingers will tend to reach about midway down your thigh for most people. I actually have a friend who's got unnaturally long arms. I also have a friend who has very shorter arms. So it's not the same for everybody, but typically about mid-thigh tends to be a good size. And then I'm just going to draw little cylinders to kind of make up the forearm. We have the forearm. And then another cylinder to make up the bicep. Bicep is right here. And same thing about here. And we're going to get into hands right now. The character's only got little circle hands, but we will have real hands later on. Okay. Then we'll get to the feet. Again, later on, we're going to be doing feet in detail. But for now, the feet are about two parts, the front and the back. Now, once you've drawn out your proportions, you can kind of look over them and see, do they measure up? So how many heads tall? Sometimes I end up making the heads a little bit too big. So if our heads are, let's see if we're using the ruler in this case. See if I need to make adjustments. So about this tall, 1, 2, 3. Yeah, I've made the body too short. So I get for not have it tilt over. Okay. So we have the head. So I'm going to make better use of the board. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Okay. So we're going to start off with just a very basic pose. Your figure standing. With arms just down by their sides, and we're just going to need to extend the arms a little bit. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And the head's a little big. Here you go. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. So about 7. Head's tall. Let's make the arms a little longer. Yes, sir. Okay. Yes, so please get started in drawing a figure just standing neutral. Try to make your figure about 7 heads tall, 7.5 heads tall. Start with a very neutral pose. Just hands to the side, straight forward. Yes, ma'am?
Do I have to do males or females?
You can do either one you want. That's a very good question. The character that I have up here is male, but the difference between drawing a man and a woman typically, I'm going to draw the more feminine outline with the red pen, is that usually a woman's shoulders are not going to be as broad as a man's shoulders are. You're also going to have it a little bit tapered in, a little bit, and you're definitely going to have more hips. Now this can change a little bit depending on the woman, depending on the proportions of the person overall. That can change, but women have typically thinner shoulders, wider hips, so their figure is a little less boxy. They're a little bit more curvy. They also have smaller hands and feet, but we're going to be getting to that soon. once you have a very light drawing of your figure, then you're ready to go on and with one that's a little bit more detailed. So typically we would have our general head shape. Our faces, we're not going to go much into faces today, but generally we have three main parts: the eyes, the nose, and the mouth. And they're actually fairly easy to measure. So those are what those lines will represent. So our eyes are actually right, they don't always seem that way. And a lot of times when you're first drawing for the first time, people tend to put the eyes too high, but our eyes are actually in the dead center of our heads. So when drawing my little circle, which for now represents the head, about in the center, I'll draw the eyes. Now, I draw them as a curve, or mostly a curve, just to keep things a little bit contoured. We don't want things to be too flat. Now, between the eyes and the chin is the nose, and then between the nose and the chin is the mouth. And then this line represents like the direction that the character's looking. So the figure is looking pretty much straight ahead. So using these guides, or using this very, very rough sketch as my basis, I'm going to go through with a black marker. What you guys will be doing is probably using your pencil pressed a little harder onto the paper. So from about here down, around the nose down, we start adding the jaw. It's still very sketchy, very loose. So my figure has a very squared jaw. If you're looking at a model, you would look at the general shape of their head. Sometimes you'll have long and circular, sometimes you'll have very squarish features. Now your ears typically start around the same baseline as your eye, and it ends about the nose level. So I'm just drawing a very general ear. I'm not going to go much into faces here. Nose. And then we have our mouth. We have our eyes here. Your hairline really depends on the person. Some people have bangs, some people will have no bangs, and some will have like receding hairlines. It just depends. We're going to keep that vague here. I'm just going to leave them bald. There you go. So then we have the neck. Now the neck doesn't just hinge straight into the body like that. We have the traps, which are kind of like a tapering of the neck into the shoulders and into the body. Now very muscular people, like if you see wrestlers or people with very strong builds, may have very noticeable or large traps, but generally we'll have just at least a little bit of a taper. So usually we just taper around here into the shoulders. Now, since I gave this figure a very squarish jaw, I'm going to go with male for the posture. There we go. So it's just a little bit of a taper from the back of the neck down into flowing into the shoulders. There we go. Now, again, the main difference between male and female proportions in general is that men tend to be more boxy in their shapes, and women tend to be a little bit more curvy. We have wider hips, more slender shoulders. You might notice actually in cartoons that male characters tend to be drawn more with more boxy shapes, while women tend to be drawn more curvy, and that's one of the reasons why, is that men generally have a more boxy structure. So if you're drawing a male, you might taper in the waist a little bit, but not a lot. Now if you're drawing a woman, you might taper it in more and then bring out the hips. For guys, they don't have much of hips, so we'll just taper it out a little bit. Now I did have a very good question about handling musculature in figures. So like drawing, so back here, this is your bicep, and the tricep is the muscle in the back. Now typically, I'm not very fit in the back of my tricep, but a lot of people aren't. For a very muscular character, you'd probably have it be more of a straight line back here. You'll find a lot of cartoons will tend to make this straight or mostly straight-ish, where the bicep will tend to be more curved on a muscular character. So for this figure, more of an average build. So this is the bicep right here, and it's the tricep. And I tend to try to flow each part into another. So the elbow, joint in here. Now typically your wrists and your ankles, where your arm goes in, where your forearm goes into your wrist, tends to taper in a little bit and then expand back out when you get to the hands. So I'm tapering this in, bring in a little bit, and I'm going to draw just a basic shape of the palm of the hand. We're going to get in the hands itself very soon. Okay. There we go. Okay. We're just going to leave the hand as boxes for now because we're going to get to hands. Now, where the thighs connect to the hips, we actually have, the way our hips work is that our thighs are actually connected to the hips like a ball joint doll. So we have the joint going into the socket, or the bone going into the socket, and then the skin would just be right on top. So we just got to be careful about the hips or the thighs flowing into the body. Sometimes I saw a few that were sort of coming out, kind of like they were hinged on the skin. So we just got to be a little careful about that. They actually don't bulge out that much from the hips. The thighs don't. Unless the character's like maybe standing in a way that their leg's going to come out from their body. So just draw here. So your thighs tend to be a little bit thicker than your calves. Not always. Again, it depends on the figure. So the thighs are a little bit thicker, and then they taper in where the knee's at, just like with the elbow. And just like how the wrist connects to the forearm, we have ankles that connect to the calf. So usually it's represented in this little bump here. There we go. And then we have the little ankle. And again, we're just doing a sort of an outline of the foot because we're going to be doing feet later on. But the feet can be divided into two parts. Sort of the ball of the foot, which is the front part here, is when you stand on your tiptoes, is what supports you. And then the back part, which is your ankle, the heel of your foot. So right now I'm just drawing them as those two different segments. There we go. And at this point, if you're comfortable with how your figure looks, then we start adding clothes on them. Maybe give them a V-neck. Now typically our clothes aren't painted on. You're going to have some protrusion. So your clothes are going to stick out a little bit from the body. So what I sometimes do is maybe draw the back of the shirt. Maybe some lines where the arms of the shirt connect to the body. Let's give them short sleeves. There you go. And then you can draw bottom part of the shirt, and then maybe some pants. Maybe they flare out a little bit. But you can put anything you want on them. But we usually draw the body underneath first, just base proportions, base sketch, and then we could draw the clothes on top, because the clothes are really just following the figure. So now that we've had a chance to kind of play around with the whole figure as kind of a whole, now let's play around with hands. So, holding your hands out, sometimes when drawing hands and you're not quite used to drawing them, sometimes we'll get sort of a filled rubber glove effect where all the fingers are sort of the same length and they don't seem to show like the bone structure of hands. But if you look at your hands, Which finger is the longest? Middle finger is the longest. What's the second longest? It's not always the same for each person. Can you tell? It's your index? Which one? It's your index? Which one is it for you? It's your index. Your ring? On mine, it's my ring too. Which is the second longest finger in your hand? Now, sometimes it's different for different people. This one can actually be a little bit, not necessarily tricky, just not necessarily the same for each person. So your second longest finger can sometimes be the index or it can be the ring finger depending on the person. Sometimes women tend to have the ring finger be a little longer and men sometimes tend to have the index finger a little longer, but that's like a most of the time, but not really all the time thing. So sometimes it's going to be the index and sometimes it's going to be the ring, but usually one of those is going to be your second longest, and then the other one's going to be almost as long as that. So these are definitely the longest. And then you're going to have your pinky and your thumb, which are actually the same length. They don't look it. I know. The thumb looks so small and stumpy, but it's actually about as long as your pinky.
They didn't know that.
I know, isn't it crazy? They don't look it because it looks so small and stubby. Now you may notice in your hands that you've got these little knuckles. Now it looks like you have, so your fingers divided, all of them except with what seems like your thumb, has 3 segments. But your thumb, while it looks like it has 2, your thumb actually goes into your palm. So your thumb actually rotates from inside the palm as well, allowing you to do this. Now the only other finger you have that can do anything like that is actually your pinky, which can pull in your palm a little bit. So these two can control your palms, while these really just go kind of up and down. Pretty neat, huh? So these two actually control the overall shape of your hand depending on what gesture you're using. Yeah. So now hands seem like they can be kind of complicated, but they're actually incredibly important for getting a really good gesture down. And they can be wonderful when you're drawing a character and really getting that character's expressiveness. So the easiest way to draw hands is really just breaking them down into their basic shape. For your palm, you have sort of a square, square-ish. Now, your knuckles actually don't line up in a complete line. They're a little bit curved. So it's not a complete square that your hand's in, sort of a soft kind of contoured square. Your thumb actually tapers out from the wrist, and it comes out about maybe a third up to a half up your palm. Your thumb comes out. And then your fingers. There's a little bit of webbing in between each one if you have them spread out all the way. And you can put them all tight together. And your pinky flows out from the side of your hand. So there's no like dimpling into your hand before your fingers start. Not typically. So we're going to start with a really base pose. I'm sorry?
Are you teaching me anatomy?
Yeah, it's really interesting because drawing ends up, and animating too, actually, combines itself with a lot of other sciences. Like if you're doing effects animation, you'll end up learning physics. Just learning how things drop, how things pop, how things fizzle. It's really interesting how that works. So what we're going to do is just a really base drawing. Whichever is your drawing hand, don't use that one. Use your other hand. Because it'll be really hard to be like draw, 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 draw. So I'm going to use my left hand as my model because I am right-handed. And with my little blue marker, I'm going to tend to draw just my hand from, for me, the back view. And I'm going to just pretend my ring's not there for now. So with your wrist, again, your forearm kind of tapers into your wrist a little bit. It kind of tapers down. So we're going to do... Let me grab my eraser. I'm probably going to need it. Okay. So if you're looking down at your hand, you'll sometimes have this little bump that kind of comes out from your wrist. This little thing. It's kind of like an ankle, except it's not. It's on your wrist. But it's part of the twisting ability. And that's usually on the outside, on the same side as your pinky, this little bump. So whether you choose to add it or not, it's up to you. I'm just going to add that little bump there. And then I'm going to just draw the overall shape of my palm, just like they're pieces of a ball joint doll. So for the fingers, again, we have 3 different segments, from here, here, and here. I'm going to draw them as cylinders. Because we're going to keep, if we can keep the shapes very simple, it will actually make it much easier when you start drawing dynamic shapes. So the hand coming towards you or drawing it in perspective, it gets a lot easier if you can just break them down into simple shapes. So we're just going to start with little cylinders. So we have yes, ma'am. Yeah, draw the hand that you don't draw with. Like use that hand as a model. That makes it a lot easier. So if you're left-handed, you can draw your right hand and just keep it forward. And we're just starting with a basic neutral pose. That way we can just get the shapes of our fingers. Now, different hands have different shapes. Also, again, like your index finger versus your ring finger, if your index finger is longer than your ring finger, you can draw it that way. You don't have to draw it exactly like I do. Also, men's hands tend to be a lot thicker, to be wider than women's hands. Our hands tend to be a little bit thinner. So I have So the tips of our fingers are the smallest part. We have and for me, my ring finger is the longest, so I'm going to keep that in mind. Yeah. Bless you. Too long. There we go. And this.